All right, let's kick off this deep dive. And, we're tackling the American Civil War today. It's a turning point in American history. And, well, it shaped a nation we know today, right?
Definitely a turning point. And I think a conflict that still gets people talking, it continues to fascinate people even now.
Yeah, and everyone thinks they know the basics, right? North versus South, blue versus gray, and all that. But trust me, there are layers here we're going to unpack.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We've got a ton of incredible sources, firsthand accounts, scholarly analogies, and I'm really excited to see what we find as we dig through all of this together.
I think it's going to be really interesting to sort of unpack all of the social and political and economic forces. It was really a complex web of all of those things that kind of led to this conflict.
So let's get right into it. What were the real root causes of the Civil War?
Well, slavery, right. I mean, that's the big one. But we have to understand the nuances and these declarations of causes, from states like Texas, Mississippi, South Carolina. They really give us, I think, a good look into the mindset of the South at the time.
Yeah, and we've got those declarations right here. And they're pretty intense. It's not just about like, oh, is slavery morally right or wrong? There's this economic anxiety, this fear of federal overreach. Like their entire way of life was under attack.
Exactly, exactly. Like if you look at Texas, they were arguing that slavery was beneficial not only to the South's economy, but they even said it was like divinely ordained and essential to like keeping order in society. They even go so far as to say that it was beneficial for the enslaved people themselves.
Wow. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around that today. But, that just shows how deeply ingrained these beliefs were at the time.
And it wasn't just Texas, South Carolina, they were adamant that the North was infringing upon their property rights by even trying to limit slavery because, of course, they saw enslaved people as property.
Yeah, which is a jarring concept for us now, for sure. But, this really gets at how intertwined slavery was with their identity, their economy, their political power.
For sure. And this fear of losing that power was huge. I mean, when Lincoln was elected in 1860, they saw that as an existential threat. A president that was openly against the expansion of slavery. That was just unthinkable.
So Lincoln's election was the trigger, the final straw.
Yeah, it was definitely a catalyst. I mean, think about it. 7 states seceded before Lincoln even took office. That just shows you how much anxiety, how much fear there was at the time.
It's like they were almost waiting for an excuse to break away. But as we see in these declarations, it's complex, right? They saw secession as the only way to protect everything they held dear.
Absolutely.
Their interests, their lifestyle, their identity,
It
really.
was self-preservation in a way.
And that brings us up to the official start of the war, April 12, 1861. Confederate forces firing on Fort Sumter in South Carolina.
Yeah, and then the nations plunged into this conflict that would last for 4 years.
4 years of brutal battles, political maneuvering, sacrifice on a scale that's hard to even imagine today.
And while the war officially ended with the Confederate surrender on April 9th, 1865, I think the echoes of that conflict, they still resonate throughout American history and society.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so within this huge epic drama, we've got Lincoln, right, leading the Union.
Of
And on the
course.
Confederate side, we've got Jefferson Davis.
Yep, their president.
And it's really interesting to compare their leadership styles. Lincoln with his eloquence and this ability to unite a fractured nation, and then Davis, who faced all these internal divisions and struggled to keep the Confederacy unified.
Yeah, they had very different challenges, for sure.
And then there are the military minds, the strategists, Grant for the Union, Lee for the Confederacy. I mean, those names are almost synonymous with Civil War tactics.
Absolutely, but we can't forget about some of the lesser-known figures who really shaped the course of the war, too. Like William Tecumseh Sherman, his scorched earth march through Georgia. It was brutal, but it was brilliant, and it really left a mark on the South.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about Joshua Chamberlain, that little round top? I mean, that heroic stand during Gettysburg? Who knows? It could have changed the outcome of the whole war.
It's amazing to think about. And then in the middle of all the bloodshed and chaos, you have these figures like Clara Barton, the angel of the battlefield, right? She risked her life to care for the wounded and ultimately founded the Red Cross. It's a reminder of the humanity and the compassion that we see even in the darkest of times.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the leaders, the generals, but what about the enslaved people? They weren't just passive bystanders in this conflict.
Oh, absolutely not. The Civil War was about their freedom, and they played a crucial role in how it all played out. And one of the most pivotal moments in that struggle was the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah, the Emancipation Proclamation, I remember learning about it in school, but honestly, I don't think I ever fully grasped its significance.
It was a game changer, really, on so many levels. It didn't immediately free all the enslaved people, but it did declare that those in Confederate territory would be free.
So it was both strategic and moral.
Exactly. It shifted the objectives of the war. Now the abolition of slavery was a central goal for the Union,
Okay.
and it really had a profound impact on the Confederacy.
How so?
Well, for one, it allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army. Imagine the courage it took for those men to fight against their former oppressors, to fight for their own freedom and the freedom of their families.
Yeah, that must have been incredibly empowering, but also terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. And around 180,000 black soldiers joined the Union ranks. That really dealt a blow to the Confederacy, both militarily and symbolically. Their presence just challenged the whole foundation of the Confederacy, which, as we've talked about, was built on the idea of white supremacy.
It's incredible to think about the ripple effects of the Emancipation Proclamation. Changed the course of the war, redefined the nation's values, and paved the way for the end of slavery in America.
It's a testament to the power of ideas and the pursuit of freedom, even in the face of such adversity.
This is already so much more than dates and battles. I'm hooked, and we've only just begun.
Oh, there's so much more. We're going to delve into those pivotal battles, the technology that came out of this, and the lasting impact of the Civil War on American society as we know it.
I can't wait.
But for now, I think it's good to just kind of reflect on what we've learned so far. The Civil War wasn't just about slavery. It was about power, identity, and these competing visions for what the nation should be. It exposed these deep flaws and forced America to confront what it really stood for.
Yeah, really powerful stuff. Okay, so we've laid the groundwork. We kind of got the causes. We've met some of the key players. Now I really want to get into, like, the actual fighting, the battles themselves. I mean, this war lasted 4 years, right? There must have been hundreds of battles.
Thousands, actually. Yeah, but some really stand out as turning points, like real shifts in momentum that really determined how the whole thing played out.
So let's talk turning points then. Which battles had the biggest impact, would you say?
Well, Gettysburg is often considered the high water mark for the Confederacy. It was July 1863, three-day clash, just brutal fighting, and it resulted in massive casualties on both sides.
Yeah, and I've heard about Pickett's charge, that Confederate assault. Sounds like something straight out of a movie.
It was a defining moment, for sure. Confederate General Pickett, he leads his men across this open field, right into a hail of Union gunfire. It was a devastating defeat for the Confederacy, pretty much ended any hope they had of a major victory in the North.
Wow, I'm getting chills just thinking about it. But you mentioned other turning points as well.
Yeah, the Siege of Vicksburg, and this was happening at the same time as Gettysburg, but over in the West, along the Mississippi River.
The Mississippi, right? That's so crucial, for transportation, controlling territory.
Exactly. And when the Union captured Vicksburg, they gained control of the entire river, which basically split the Confederacy in two, and it cut off vital supply lines.
So Gettysburg crushes their hopes in the East. Vicksburg cripples their war effort in the West. It's amazing how these battles, happening miles apart, had this combined impact.
It really shows how interconnected this conflict was and how strategic the Union commanders were in coordinating these offensives.
Right, okay, so we've got these epic battles. But wars aren't just fought on strategy, right? There's the whole logistical side of things. Food, weapons, ammunition, all of that has to come from somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. This was a new kind of war, an industrialized war, and it required massive resources, sophisticated supply chains.
But I'm guessing the Union, with its industrial might, had an advantage here.
Definitely. The North had more factories, more manpower, a better financial system. They could just outproduce the Confederacy when it came to weapons, ammo, and all the essential supplies.
But the South wasn't totally outmatched, right?
No, they had their own advantages. They were fighting on home turf, so they knew the terrain. And they had some brilliant military leaders like Robert E. Lee. They were able to make the most of what they had.
Yeah, but still a classic David and Goliath scenario.
In a way, yes. And one of the things that really tipped the scales for the Union was their infrastructure, especially their railroads. They could move troops and supplies so much faster than the Confederacy could.
The railroads, that's an interesting point. I never really thought about how crucial they were.
Oh, they were transformative. Before the war, armies moved at the speed of a horse-drawn wagon. But with railroads, you could suddenly transport thousands of soldiers, tons of supplies, hundreds of miles, in just a few days.
Wow, that's a game changer.
Totally. And it wasn't just railroads. The Civil War saw all sorts of technological innovation in weapons, communication, everything.
Speaking of technology, I was reading about the ironclad warships. It sounds like something out of science fiction.
It was revolutionary for naval warfare. When the Monitor and the Merrimack clashed in 1862, that was the end of wooden warships. It ushered in this whole new age of armored vessels.
Amazing. So we got ironclads at sea. What about the weapons the soldiers were using on land? Anything new there?
Oh, for sure. Rifled muskets were huge. They were way more accurate and had a much longer range than the old smoothbore muskets.
And that must have been devastating on the battlefield.
It was. And then you have the mini ball, this cone-shaped bullet. It expanded when it was fired, so it created these huge destructive wounds. Sadly, these new weapons contributed to the incredibly high casualty counts we see in the Civil War.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. We've covered the battles, the logistics, the technology. But what about the civilians back home? How did this war affect their lives, both in the North and the South?
The Civil War touched everyone, even those far away from the fighting.
I imagine there were shortages, economic hardship, that sort of thing.
Yes, definitely. In the South, the Union blockade really hurt their economy. There were shortages of basic necessities. And in the North, even though their industry was booming, there was still inflation and everyone was worried about losing loved ones in battle.
It must have been incredibly stressful for families.
Absolutely. And for women, the war brought about significant changes. With so many men away fighting, women had to step up.
I can imagine.
They ran farms, businesses, worked in factories, served as nurses. Their contributions were essential, and their experiences really challenged traditional gender roles.
So the Civil War wasn't just a military conflict. It was this huge social upheaval.
Exactly, and its legacy is something we still grapple with today.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that. But I'm also realizing how much more there is to learn.
Oh, absolutely. The Civil War was so complex, and its impact is still felt in so many ways, but that's what makes it so fascinating to study. It's a story of heroism, sacrifice, innovation, destruction, a nation trying to define itself and figure out what it truly stands for.
Okay, so we've talked about the battles, the technology, the impact on civilians. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I have to ask, why does all of this still matter today? I mean, the war ended over 150 years ago?
It's a question historians are always asking. The short answer is that the legacy of the Civil War is everywhere. It's part of American identity, politics, our struggle for equality, all of it.
Okay, I get that, but can you give me some specific examples? How do we actually see these echoes of the Civil War today?
Well, let's start with the most obvious one, the abolition of slavery. At its core, the Civil War was a fight to end this horrific institution. And while the fight for racial equality has been long and hard, the war was a huge turning point.
Right, the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. A direct result of the war, but like you said, the fight for equality didn't stop there.
Exactly. The Civil War settled the question of slavery, but it started all these new debates about citizenship, voting rights, even the definition of freedom. And we're still having these debates today.
It's wild to think that things we argue about now have roots in this conflict from so long ago.
It is, and it's not just about race and equality. The Civil War also completely changed the relationship between the federal government and the states.
So that states' rights argument that the South used to secede, that's done?
Not completely. We still debate federalism today, but the Civil War really established the supremacy of the Constitution and that the Union couldn't be divided.
Like the nation went through this fire and came out stronger? But it still has these scars that remind us of how fragile unity can be.
That's a great way to put it. And those scars, those tensions, they still come up in our conversations about voting rights, social justice, how we remember our history.
It's almost like the ghosts of the Civil War are still here, challenging us to live up to these ideals of equality and justice that people fought so hard for.
And that's exactly why it's so important to study and understand this conflict. It's not just dates and battles. It's about grappling with the legacy of slavery, the meaning of freedom, the fight for a more just society.
Man, this has been incredible. We started with this simple question, what caused the Civil War? And we ended up exploring the soul of America.
That's history for you. It's not just about the past. It's about understanding who we are and where we came from. And the Civil War, even with all its complexity, it gives us this lens to look at ourselves as a nation.
I love that. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on this part of American history. But I also feel this sense of responsibility to keep learning, to keep having these tough conversations.
That's the biggest takeaway I hope people get. The Civil War might be over, but its legacy is alive in the choices we make, the policies we debate, the stories we tell. It's up to all of us to really think about this history and use its lessons to make a better future.
Yeah, really powerful stuff. This deep dive has been eye-opening, thought-provoking, at times even a little emotional, honestly, but it's definitely left me wanted to know more.
That's the beauty of it. There's always more to discover, more to think about. The journey doesn't end here.
So true. Well, I want to thank you for guiding us through this topic. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the American Civil War. We hope you learned something new, that you have some new questions, and that you have a deeper understanding of this really important time in our nation's history. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going. 32-0.